Sweat stung Cole's eyes, mixing with the metallic tang of split lips and cheap canvas. He pointed a taped finger at the scrawny guy in the gray windbreaker. The crowd roared in derision. They wanted a slaughter. They didn't know the quiet man adjusting his cuffs was Blaine Fisher. Numbness crept up Cole Reynolds' right forearm, a familiar, dull throbbing that told him his ulna had taken too much impact. He stood in the center of the makeshift ring, the soles of his bare feet tacky against the dried blood and spilled beer coating the canvas. The air in the abandoned meatpacking plant hung heavy, a suffocating blanket of humidity, body odor, and the sharp medicinal bite of camphor oil. Water dripped from rusted overhead pipes, hissing as it hit the hot glass of the halogen work lights strung up by thick yellow extension cords. Cole spat a glob of crimson onto the mat. He didn't feel victorious. He just felt tired. At 28, his knees ground like rusted gears when he squatted, and his knuckles were perpetually swollen, calcium deposits forming jagged ridges under his skin. He was the reigning champion of this underground circuit, a title that earned him nothing but cash in crumpled envelopes and a target on his back. Alicio Wilson hoisted himself onto the ring apron, the ropes groaning under his weight. Alicio smelled of cheap rye whiskey and desperation, his thinning hair plastered to his scalp with sweat. He leaned in, spraying spit as he spoke. "Beautiful work, Coley. You took his head clean off." Alicio grinned, revealing teeth the color of old piano keys. "But they're restless. The main event ended too quick. We need filler, open challenge, point to a face, drag him up here, play with your food for a couple of rounds." Cole stared through Alicio, his jaw tight. He hated the promoter. He hated the 200 degenerates pressing against the chain-link fence that served as a barricade, screaming for more violence like starving dogs. They didn't understand the mechanics of it, the terrible toll it took on the human body. They just wanted the spectacle of destruction. He turned away from Alicio, dragging his heavily taped hands down his face, smearing sweat and grease into his eyes. He paced the perimeter. The crowd surged forward, hands reaching through the chain link, voices merging into a deafening, discordant roar. "Pick me, Reynolds! I'll snap your neck!" A steroid-bloated bouncer screamed, veins bulging in his forehead. Cole ignored him. He wanted someone who would break easily, someone who wouldn't make him work for his money. His eyes scanned the sea of contorted, aggressive faces, looking for the weak link. The tourists, the thrill-seekers who came down to the basement to feel dangerous for an hour before going back to their suburban lawns. Then he saw him. Standing by a concrete support pillar, well back from the frenzied front rows, was a man who didn't belong. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't waving his arms. He simply stood there, tucked loosely into the pockets of a lightweight gray windbreaker. He wore dark slacks and sensible leather shoes. His black hair was neatly parted, unbothered by the stifling humidity. It wasn't his attire that caught Cole's attention, though. It was his eyes. They were intensely focused, tracking Cole's pacing with the clinical detachment of an anatomist observing a specimen. There was no fear in those eyes, but no bravado either. Just a heavy, settling calm that felt completely alien in the blood-soaked basement. Resentment flared in Cole's chest. He despised that look. He sacrificed his body, piece by piece, to claw his way to the top of this violent hierarchy, and this man looked at him like he was a moderately interesting insect. Cole stopped pacing. He raised his right arm, the white athletic tape stained brown and red, and pointed a rigid finger directly at the man by the pillar. "You!" Cole barked. His voice was hoarse, a gravelly rasp that barely carried over the noise, but the gesture was unmistakable. "Who? Windbreaker, get in the cage." The crowd followed his finger. A beat of confused silence swept through the room, quickly replaced by a chorus of groans and angry shouts. "Are you kidding me, Reynolds?" Someone yelled from the bleachers. "He's a pencil pusher. Pick a fighter." Boos rained down, echoing off the concrete walls. They weren't booing the stranger. They were booing Cole. They felt cheated. They had paid $50 a head to see two monsters collide, not to watch a professional executioner slaughter a lamb. Cole let his arm drop. "I said get in here, unless you're just down here to take notes." The stranger didn't react to the insult. He didn't look around at the jeering crowd. He simply withdrew his hands from his pockets, pushed off the concrete pillar, and began to walk. His gait was strange. It wasn't the heavy rolling strut of a fighter, nor the nervous shuffle of a victim. It was perfectly smooth. His head remained entirely level as he glided through the parting crowd. The angry spectators shoved each other to get out of his way, somehow instinctively reluctant to brush against his shoulders. Cole watched him approach, a prickle of unease scratching at the base of his skull. The man was small, 5'7", maybe 140 soaking wet. Cole had 70 pounds on him, easy. It should be a massacre. But as the man reached the chain-link door and stepped into the harsh glare of the ring lights, Cole noticed the terrifying stillness in his shoulders. There was no tension. None. "This is a joke," Alicio muttered, stepping back. "Don't kill him, Cole. I don't want the cops down here." "Just ring the damn bell," Cole replied, never taking his eyes off the man. Fluorescent lights buzzed an angry electrical hum overhead, the only sound left in the room as the stranger ducked through the ropes. He stood near the corner, his presence seeming to suck the remaining oxygen out of the humid air. He didn't look at Cole. He looked at his own shoes. Slowly, deliberately, he unlaced his Oxfords. He placed them neatly side by side on the apron outside the ropes. He reached for the zipper of his windbreaker, pulling it down with a smooth motion. Underneath, he wore a simple, tight-fitting white undershirt. He folded the windbreaker, taking a moment to align the fissures and draped it over the top turnbuckle. The sheer domesticity of the act in the middle of a blood-stained fighting ring sent a ripple of bewildered murmurs through the crowd. Cole felt his jaw clench so hard his molars ached. He was bouncing lightly on his toes, shaking out his heavy arms, trying to keep the adrenaline spiking. The waiting was killing him. "Hey!" Cole snapped. "You done folding laundry?" The stranger turned to face him. He stepped into the center of the ring in bare feet. He didn't take a traditional fighting stance. He didn't raise his hands to guard his face. He simply stood with his right foot slightly forward, his hands resting lightly near his hips. His chest rose and fell in a slow, almost imperceptible rhythm. "Rules are simple," Alicio barked from the outside, sounding nervous. "No biting, no gouging. You go until he taps, Cole. Got it? When he taps, you back off." Cole nodded. The stranger gave no indication he had heard. Alicio struck the metal post with a wrench. A sharp metallic crack echoed through the room. Cole exploded forward. He wasn't going to play with this guy. He was going to put him to S. Fisher immediately and go find a bag of ice for his hands. 2 heavy, rushing steps closed the distance. Cole planted his left foot, twisting his hips violently to generate maximum torque, and launched a right roundhouse kick aimed squarely at the man's rib cage. It was a signature move. The impact felt like getting hit with a baseball bat swung from a moving truck. Cole had snapped femurs with it. He fully committed to the strike, his shins slicing through the heavy air with a sickening velocity. He hit absolutely nothing. The kinetic energy of the missed strike yanked Cole off balance, spinning him awkwardly on his plant foot. Panic, icy and sudden, flooded his veins. He scrambled to correct his posture, throwing a wild backhand just to cover his retreat. The stranger wasn't retreating. He hadn't leaped backward to avoid the kick. He had stepped inside the arc of the leg. Cole turned back around and froze. A fist hovered precisely half an inch from the bridge of his nose. Cole hadn't seen the arm move. There was no wind-up, no telegraphing shift of weight. 1 second the man's hands were at his hips. The next, 2 knuckles were parked in Cole's field of vision, so close he could smell the faint scent of jasmine soap on the man's skin. The fist was vibrating slightly, holding back a tremendous coiled tension. The crowd, previously screaming for blood, fell dead silent. You could hear the condensation dripping from the pipes. The stranger held the pulled punch for 1 agonizing second. Then, he slowly retracted his hand, returning to his relaxed hands-down posture. He hadn't breathed hard. He hadn't even blinked. Humiliation burned in Cole's chest like swallowed acid. He was the champion. He was the apex predator, and this guy had just showed him mercy in front of 200 people. "Fight back!" Cole roared, spit flying from his lips. He charged again, abandoning technique for brute, overwhelming violence. He threw a 1-2 combination, a heavy left jab followed by a devastating right cross, stepping heavily into the punches. The stranger tilted his head. Just tilted it. Cole's left glove grazed the man's ear, the punch sailing harmlessly over his shoulder. Before the right cross could even leave Cole's hip, something slammed into his lead leg. It wasn't a powerful, sweeping kick. It was a short, sharp trapping motion. The stranger's lead foot hooked precisely behind Cole's ankle, accompanied by a simultaneous jarring push to Cole's chest with an open palm. The physics of it were infuriatingly simple. Cole's momentum was moving forward. His base was suddenly removed. Cole crashed to the canvas, hitting the mat with his shoulder and tumbling clumsily to a halt. The impact knocked the wind out of him, a sharp gasp of air escaping his lungs. He tasted old blood and sweat from the dirty floor. He scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily now, confusion warring with rage. He looked at his opponent. The stranger was exactly where he had been standing before the exchange. He hadn't pursued Cole to the ground. He was just waiting. "Stop dancing and fight!" someone in the crowd screamed, but the voice lacked conviction. The mob was starting to realize what they were watching. Cole circled, his breath rasping in his throat. His heavy legs felt like they were moving through wet cement. He analyzed the man. There were no tells. A fighter breathes in before he strikes. A fighter shifts his weight, clenches his jaw, narrows his eyes. This man did none of that. He was like water. When Cole pushed, he yielded. When Cole retreated, he flowed forward. Desperation clawed at Cole. He decided to close the distance completely, to grapple. He was bigger, stronger. If he could just get his hands on the guy, he could crush him. Cole rushed in, leading with his head off the center line, arms outstretched to clinch the man's waist. The stranger moved, finally. It wasn't a block. It was an interception. As Cole reached out, the stranger's lead hand shot forward, backhanding Cole's right wrist, parrying it violently across Cole's own body. In the same millisecond, the stranger's rear hand snapped out in a straight vertical punch. The blow connected square on Cole's sternum. It didn't look like a hard punch. There was no massive shoulder rotation, but the impact felt like a localized explosion. The shockwave traveled straight through Cole's ribcage, vibrating deeply in his spine. Cole staggered backward, his legs giving out. He dropped to one knee, clutching his chest, his mouth open as he tried to pull air into paralyzed lungs. The pain was sharp, electric, and utterly debilitating. He looked up through tear-blurred eyes. The stranger was standing above him now, not gloating, not aggressive. He merely looked down at Cole with a profound, almost sorrowful understanding. The stillness in the man was no longer alien. It was terrifying. It was the stillness of the deep ocean, capable of swallowing ships whole without a ripple on the surface. Alicio Wilson was shouting something from the edge of the ring, but Cole couldn't hear him over the roaring blood in his own ears. The booze had vanished completely. The audience was entirely silent, gripped by the awe of witnessing something entirely outside their comprehension of violence. They had come to see a brawl. They were watching a masterclass in physics and human geometry. Cole tried to stand, his muscles trembling. He was the undisputed champion, a monster of the underground, and he was being dismantled by a man who looked like he was waiting for a bus. He spat onto the mat, forcing his leaden legs to push him upward. If he was going down, he was going to go down swinging. He raised his fists, feeling the terrible, heavy futility of the gesture. The man in the center of the ring watched him rise, his expression unchanging, a ghost in the harsh halogen light. Gravity felt entirely different than it had 3 minutes ago. It pulled at Cole's heavy, sweat-soaked shoulders, dragging him toward the stained canvas. He forced himself upright, his lead leg trembling. The localized explosion in his chest still radiated a dull, terrifying ache, making every breath feel like drawing air through a cracked straw. He stared at the man in the white undershirt. Blaine hadn't moved to capitalize on the knockdown. He remained perfectly centered, his breathing steady, entirely unbothered by the suffocating basement heat. Anger, hot and irrational, warred with a creeping cold dread in Cole's gut. He was a survivor. He had crawled out of dirt floor orphanages and brutal foster homes by being the hardest, most unyielding thing in the room. He solved problems with blunt force trauma. You didn't outthink an opponent in this meatpacking plant. You broke their will. You made them taste their own blood until they decided they'd rather be anywhere else. But how do you break the will of a shadow? Cole bit down on his mouthpiece, tasting the familiar metallic tang of his own beef Fisherding gums. He changed his stance, abandoning the kickboxing range. He was going to smother the smaller man. Dirty boxing, clinch work. He'd take the damage on the way in, pin the guy against the chain link, and grind him down with elbows and collarbone strikes. It was ugly, grating work, but it was all Cole had left. He lunged. He tucked his chin tight to his sternum, raised a high guard, and bulldozed forward. He expected a counterstrike, a sharp jab to the bridge of his nose, or a kick to his lead knee. Instead, he met absolute emptiness. As Cole's mass barreled into the space Blaine occupied, the smaller man simply wasn't there anymore. Blaine pivoted on his lead foot, rotating his hips with the smooth, silent grace of a heavy vault door swinging on oiled hinges. He slipped to the outside of Cole's guard, letting Cole's own violent momentum carry him blindly forward. Before Cole could hit the brakes, a hand clamped onto the back of his neck. It wasn't a death grip. It was a firm, guiding pressure, redirecting Cole's unbalanced weight downward. Simultaneously, a sharp, driving knee buried itself into the soft tissue of Cole's outer thigh. The sciatic nerve lit up like a struck match. Cole's right leg collapsed instantly, entirely devoid of strength. He pitched forward, his face slamming into the turnbuckle pad. The heavy canvas rope bit roughly into his collarbone, smelling intensely of old sweat and mildew. He hung there for a second, gasping, his deadened leg dragging uselessly beneath him. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered in the front row. The voice was terribly loud in the quiet room. Cole pushed off the ropes, heavily favoring his left side. His right leg felt like a wooden stump, buzzing with angry pins and needles. He turned to face the center of the ring. Blaine was waiting, relaxed, his arms hanging loosely. This was the terrifying part. Blaine wasn't fighting with malice. There was no snarling, no puffing of the chest, no animalistic grunts of exertion. He was dismantling Cole with the clinical detached precision of a mechanic taking apart a busted engine. Every movement was a terrifyingly efficient answer to a poorly asked question. Cole threw a desperate, lunging left hook. It was sloppy, telegraphed by a mile, fueled entirely by the stubborn refusal to submit. Blaine didn't dodge. He moved into the strike. He raised his right arm, catching Cole's heavy wrist on his forearm. With a sickeningly fast circular motion, Blaine rolled his arm over Cole's, trapping the larger man's limb against his own chest. Cole felt his shoulder joint scream as his arm was forcibly immobilized. In that same fraction of a second, Blaine's free left hand shot out. Two knuckles rapped sharply against Cole's temple. It wasn't a knockout blow. It was a tap. A sharp, stinging reminder of absolute dominance. If there had been an ounce of body weight behind it, Cole's orbital bone would have shattered like cheap porcelain. Cole yanked his arm free, stumbling backward, his vision swimming with sudden gray spots. The sheer speed of the exchange broke something fundamental inside his mind. He realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that he was fighting entirely in the past. By the time Cole committed to a strike, Blaine was already solving it, positioning himself 3 steps ahead. The crowd wasn't booing anymore. The bloodlust had completely evaporated. These cynical, violent men who spent their weekends betting on human suffering were pressed against the chain-link fence, completely mesmerized. They were witnessing a violent alchemy. They were watching raw, ugly brawling be exposed by high art. Alicio Wilson stood paralyzed by the ring steps, the cigar falling from his slack jaw, leaving a trail of gray ash on his cheap suit lapel. Cole's lungs burned, begging for oxygen. The adrenaline dump was leaving his system, replaced by a profound, heavy exhaustion. He looked at the blood smeared across his taped knuckles. It felt absurd. He felt absurd. A caveman swinging a club at the wind. He looked up at Blaine. The quiet man met his gaze. There was no pity in those dark, focused eyes, but there was no cruelty either. It was an acknowledgement, a silent, unyielding demand for truth. "Are you done lying to yourself?" the eyes seemed to ask. Cole let out a ragged, wet breath. He wasn't done. He couldn't be. His ego, forged in alleyways and blood-soaked rings, wouldn't allow him to simply quit. If he was going to fall, he needed to be put down. He squared his shoulders, ignoring the throbbing in his dead leg, and raised his hands one last time. Fluorescent light bounced off the sweat pooling in the hollow of Cole's collarbone. He tasted copper and failure. Every instinct screamed at him to stay on the outside, to run out the clock of this phantom round, but he knew the rules of the basement. You don't survive by hiding. He planted his back foot, ignoring the agonizing flare of pain in his sciatic nerve. He abandoned the jabs, the feints, the intricate footwork he usually relied on to mask his intentions. This was pure, unadulterated desperation. He was going to throw everything he had, every ounce of his 210 pounds, into one final overhand right. If it landed, it would take a cinder block off a wall. Cole exploded off his back foot. The canvas squeaked beneath his toes. He whipped his hip forward, throwing his shoulder over his ear, channeling his entire mass into the leather wrapping around his fist. It was a beautiful, terrible punch, born of pure survival instinct. Blaine didn't retreat. He didn't slip to the outside. He did the one thing that defied all conventional fighting logic. He stepped directly into the path of the incoming missile. As Cole's massive fist arced through the humid air, Blaine's lead foot slid forward, closing the distance to 0. Blaine raised his left hand and open palm and slapped the inside of Cole's bicep. The parry was minimal, barely an inch of deflection, but at the velocity Cole was moving, an inch was a mile. The heavy overhand right sailed harmlessly past Blaine's left ear, the wind of it rustling his black hair. Now, Cole was completely exposed. His momentum had carried his chest squarely into Blaine's striking range. Blaine was standing flat-footed, entirely relaxed. His right fist rested lightly near his own hip, no more than 3 inches from the center of Cole's solar plexus. Cole braced for a hook, an uppercut, a devastating knee to the chin. He waited for the wind-up. It never came. There was a sudden, violent, kinetic snap. Blaine's hips jerked forward a fraction of an inch. His shoulders dropped, locking his frame into perfect anatomical alignment. The fist resting near his hip didn't pull back. It simply uncoiled forward. The impact sounded like a wet, heavy bag being hit with a steel baseball bat. A localized shockwave tore through Cole's sternum. The sheer, concentrated force of the blow bypassed his ribs, traveling directly through his diaphragm and echoing out through his spine. It didn't push him, it blasted him. Cole's feet left the canvas. He flew backward, a 210-pound mass of muscle rendered entirely weightless by a 3-inch punch. He slammed into the chain-link fence, the metal rattling violently against the rusted pipes. The force of the impact shook the dust from the overhead rafters. Cole slid down the fence, his back leaving a smear of sweat against the metal until his bruised hips hit the dirty mat. He sat there, his legs splayed out awkwardly, his head resting against the wire mesh. His lungs refused to work. His diaphragm was in absolute spasm. He stared up at the rusted ceiling pipes, his mouth open, sucking greedily at the hot, humid air, but finding no oxygen. The basement was completely silent. 200 violent men held their breath simultaneously. In the center of the ring, Blaine let his arm drop back to his side. He didn't pose. He didn't look at the crowd. He stood perfectly still for 3 seconds, his chest rising and falling in that same slow, imperceptible rhythm. Slowly, Cole's vision tunneled back in. The agonizing cramp in his chest began to release, allowing a jagged, gasping breath to rush into his lungs. He tasted dust. He felt the rough canvas biting into his bare skin. He looked toward the center of the ring. Blaine was walking away. He didn't step over Cole to gloat. He simply turned his back, walked to the ropes, and slipped neatly between them. He picked up his folded gray windbreaker from the top turnbuckle. He shook it out, slipping his arms into the F-fissures, and pulled the zipper up to his chest. Next, he stepped down onto the apron and sat carefully on the edge. He picked up his sensible leather Oxfords. With deliberate, quiet movements, he laced up the left shoe, then the right. He tied double knots, ensuring they were secure. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The burly bouncer who had screamed for Cole's blood earlier was staring at Blaine with wide, unblinking eyes, his hands loosely gripping the chain link. Alicio Wilson was leaning against the ring post, looking like a man who had just watched a ghost walk through a solid wall. Blaine stood up. He brushed a speck of dust from his slacks. He didn't look back at the ring, nor at the battered champion sitting slumped against the cage. He simply slipped his hands into the pockets of his windbreaker, his posture completely relaxed, and walked toward the heavy steel exit doors at the back of the basement. The crowd parted for him. They didn't just step aside, they shrank back, flattening themselves against the concrete walls and support pillars to give him a wide berth. The heavy scent of cheap beer and stale smoke seemed to part with him, leaving only the sharp tang of camphor and quiet awe in his wake. The steel door creaked open, admitting a sliver of cool night air into the sweltering basement, and then clanged shut. He was gone. Cole sat against the fence, his chest throbbing with a deep, bone-deep ache. He looked down at his taped hands, stained with his own blood. He had spent his entire adult life building a fortress of violence around himself, convincing himself that brute strength and a high pain tolerance made him untouchable. A scrawny man in a windbreaker had walked in and dismantled that fortress without breaking a sweat, leaving Cole completely exposed. Cole closed his eyes, leaning his heavy head back against the chain link. The crowd around him was beginning to murmur, low and subdued, the aggressive energy of the night utterly shattered. For the first time in 10 years, Cole didn't feel like a champion. He didn't feel like a monster. Sitting in the dirt and the blood, his lungs burning and his ego entirely destroyed, Cole Reynolds took a deep, shuddering breath and smiled. He finally understood how little he actually knew. The cage door swings shut, but the legend of this night will be fissured through the concrete walls of this basement forever. A true master doesn't just break bones, he breaks reality. If you felt every brutal impact, every missed strike, and the terrifying stillness of a martial arts god walking among mortals, hit that like button. Share this story with anyone who respects the discipline of the fight, and subscribe to the channel for more raw, unfiltered storytelling.